All right, let's talk about the impossible thing that just happened. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know the rhythm of the semiconductor war. It has been the same story on repeat for 4 years. The United States builds a wall. The United States tightens the screws. The United States says no. And on the other side, China scrambles. China tries to climb the wall. China tries to smuggle the chips. China tries to innovate its way out of a corner. It has always been a story of American denial and Chinese desperation. But in the last 48 hours, the entire geopolitical map of the technology world didn't just shift. It flipped completely upside down. We are looking at a historical reversal, a moment that defies the logic of the last half-decade. Just days after the United States government, specifically the Trump administration, finally signaled that it would open the gates and allow Nvidia to resume shipping its most powerful AI hardware to China, the door didn't just close. It was slammed shut. But here's the twist. It wasn't Washington holding the padlock this time, it was Beijing. According to explosive new reports coming out of China, customs authorities at major ports have received explicit, severe instructions to block the entry of Nvidia's H200 AI accelerators. We are not talking about a tariff. We are not talking about a regulatory review. Insiders are describing this as basically a ban. At the exact same time, in closed-door meetings that are sending shivers through the boardrooms of Shenzhen and Hangzhou, Chinese government officials have reportedly summoned the country's biggest technology giants, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, and delivered a message that is as clear as it is terrifying for their business models. Stop buying Nvidia. Do not place new orders. Unless you have a special circumstance, the era of building your future on American silicon is over. This is an earthquake. We are talking about $54 billion worth of silicon. 2 million H200 chips that were destined for Chinese data centers are now effectively frozen in a geopolitical limbo. So, what is actually happening here? Why would China, a country that is famously starving for compute power, a country that has been paying scalpers triple the price just to get their hands on a single GPU, suddenly turn away the most powerful AI chip they are legally allowed to buy? Is this a negotiation tactic? Is it a bluff? Or have we finally reached the moment where the silicon iron curtain becomes impenetrable? Not because the US wants it to be, but because China does? To understand the sheer insanity of this moment, we have to go back and look at the timeline, because the sequence of events here is incredibly suspicious. It started earlier this week, on January 13th, 2026. The U.S. administration made a massive policy pivot. After months of lobbying from Silicon Valley, the White House officially approved the export of the Nvidia H200 to China. This was supposed to be the relief valve. The H200 is the successor to the H100. It is the hardware that every AI company on Earth is fighting over. The U.S. government attached some heavy strings, of course. They demanded a 25% tax on every chip sold, a profit share for the U.S. Treasury. They put a cap on volume. They demanded third-party verification to ensure the chips weren't used for military simulations. But despite all those hurdles, the green light was given. Nvidia prepared the logistics. The wafers were allocated at TSMC. The packaging facilities were spinning up. The floodgates were supposed to open. Then, less than 24 hours later, on January 14th, the Chinese Customs Authority effectively said no. This isn't just a bureaucratic delay. This is a coordinated state-level rejection. The reports indicate that Chinese officials told customs agents that H200 chips are not permitted to enter. They didn't cite a specific law. They didn't publish a public manifesto in the state newspaper. They just froze the supply chain. And it goes deeper than just the ports. The window guidance, that is the term economists use for those informal, off-the-record orders given by the Chinese government to its companies, has shifted dramatically. For years, the guidance was, buy domestic if you can, but buy Nvidia if you must. Now, the guidance has hardened. It is now, do not buy foreign unless you absolutely have to, and you better have a good excuse. There is a theory circulating among geopolitical strategists that this is a leverage play. We know that President Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing in April to meet with Xi Jinping. By blocking these chips now, China is essentially taking a hostage. They know the US government actually wants that tax revenue. They know Nvidia needs that market growth to justify its valuation. By freezing $54 billion in orders, Beijing is creating a massive bargaining chip. They are signaling that they don't need American permission to build their AI future, or at least they are willing to pretend they don't to get a better deal on other trade issues. But there is a second, more permanent possibility. This might not be a negotiation tactic. This might be the kill switch for the Nvidia ecosystem in China. See, for the last 3 years, China has been pouring billions into its own domestic chip champions, specifically Huawei and its Ascend series. The fear in Beijing is cannibalization. If Nvidia is allowed to flood the Chinese market with H200s, Chinese tech companies who are rational economic actors will buy Nvidia every single time. It is the better product. It has the software ecosystem with CUDA. It is the industry standard. If the H200 flows freely, Huawei's new Ascend 910C dies on the vine. No one buys the second best domestic option when the world's best is available. So by blocking the H200, the Chinese government is forcing its own tech giants to eat their vegetables. They are forcing Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance to make the painful, expensive switch to Huawei, ensuring that the domestic supply chain gets the funding and the user data it needs to mature. It is a high-stakes gamble. They are sacrificing short-term AI performance for long-term sovereignty. Let's dig into the hardware for a second, because you need to understand what exactly is being banned here. Why is the H200 such a big deal? The Nvidia H200 is a monster. It is not a brand new architecture. It is an upgrade to the H100, but it is the upgrade that matters most for artificial intelligence: memory. The H200 is the first GPU to use HBM3E high bandwidth memory 3E. This gives it massive capacity and speed. For large language models, memory bandwidth is often the bottleneck, not just raw compute. The H200 delivers 4.8 terabytes per second of memory bandwidth. Compared to the compliant chips Nvidia was previously selling to China, the H200, the difference is night and day. The H200 delivers roughly 6 times the performance of the H200s. The H20D was a neutered chip, intentionally crippled to meet US export controls. It was useful, but it wasn't a game changer. The H200 is a game changer. And that is why the US ban was so significant, and why this Chinese reversal is so shocking. The US thought they were, holding the ultimate card. We will let you have the H200, but you have to pay us. And China looked at that card and said, keep it. Now, let's look at the domestic alternative that China is betting the house on: the Huawei Ascend 910C. You will hear a lot of conflicting reports about this chip. Some state media in China claim it matches the Nvidia H100. Independent benchmarks suggest it is still lagging behind, particularly in yield rates, meaning how many functional chips they can actually manufacture per wafer. However, the 910C is real, it is powerful, and it is the centerpiece of China's Plan B. US officials have reportedly reviewed the specs of the 910C and concluded that Huawei could produce a few million of these units by 2026. That is a terrifying number for Washington. If Huawei can actually manufacture millions of near-peer AI chips, the entire US export control regime has failed. This is likely why the US suddenly approved the H200 export in the first place. It is a strategy called flooding the zone. If you sell the H200 to China, you undercut Huawei. You keep Chinese companies addicted to Nvidia's CUDA platform. You make sure that Huawei doesn't get the revenue it needs to build the next generation. Beijing saw this trap coming. They recognized that the H200 was a sugar-coated bullet. It looks like a gift, high-performance compute for your AI sector, but it is actually a weapon designed to destroy your domestic semiconductor independence. So, they blocked it. And the fallout is immediate. Reports are coming in that Chinese customs agents are not just stopping bulk shipments, they are cracking down on everything. We have seen reports of enforcement teams deploying to major ports to inspect data center hardware, looking for anything that resembles a smuggled Nvidia GPU. This brings us to the gray market, which has been the lifeline for Chinese AI labs for years. And this is where the story gets really wild. Until this week, if you were a Chinese startup and you couldn't legally buy H100s, you went to the gray market in electronics hubs like Huaqiangbei in Shenzhen. You paid double or triple the price, and you got a card that was smuggled in from Singapore or the Middle East or through a complex shell company structure. It was an open secret, but the U.S. Department of Justice has just blown that wide open. Just as this policy war was heating up, federal prosecutors in the U.S. announced the takedown of a massive smuggling ring. This was called Operation Gatekeeper, and it exposed a network that had moved over $160 million worth of Nvidia H200 chips into China. The details of this operation read like a spy novel. The central figure was a Texas businessman named Alan Hao-Tzu. According to the DOJ, Su and his network were buying these restricted chips in the U.S., but they weren't just shipping them in FedEx boxes. They were taking the GPUs to warehouses, stripping off the Nvidia labels, and relabeling them as generic parts, or using fake brand names like SandCan. They created a web of fake companies. They falsified shipping manifests. They routed the chips through intermediary countries to mask their final destination. And the funding? Prosecutors allege that over $50 million of the money backing this scheme came directly from Chinese sources. This bust is significant because it shows the scale of the desperation. $160 million is just one ring, just one network. If that is what the feds caught, imagine what they haven't caught. But now, with the Chinese government directive to block H200, the gray market is facing a double squeeze. The U.S. is arresting the smugglers on the exit side, and China is blocking the goods on the entry side. The directive to block H200 implies a tightening of the net that we have never seen before. If the government is telling Alibaba, don't buy this, they are certainly not going to let a startup buy it from a scalper in Shenzhen. The economic numbers involved here are staggering. Nvidia's inventory of H200 chips is about 700,000 units globally right now. Chinese companies have placed orders for 2 million. That is 3 times Nvidia's current stock. Think about the supply chain chaos this creates. Nvidia has likely already allocated silicon wafers at TSMC to fill these orders. They have booked the packaging capacity. They have the logistics lined up. And now, the customer, or rather, the customer's government, has said, we won't let it in. This leaves companies like Alibaba Cloud in a desperate position. They have reportedly ordered 200,000 H200 chips for deployment in 2026. Those chips are now sitting in a regulatory black hole. Does Alibaba wait and hope the policy changes? Do they lobby Beijing for an exemption? Or do they tear up their infrastructure plans and redesign their data centers around Huawei's Ascend architecture? The latter option is painful. Redesigning for a different chip architecture isn't just plug and play. You have to rewrite software kernels. You have to deal with different networking standards. Huawei uses its own interconnects, not Nvidia's NVLink. It is a massive engineering headache that could set Chinese AI progress back by months, maybe years. And that is the price Beijing is willing to pay. There is another layer to this, the special circumstances loophole. The reports state that Beijing might allow H200 purchases for special circumstances, specifically citing university R&D partnerships. This is a classic dual-track strategy. They want the best hardware for their top-tier researchers who are inventing the future algorithms, but for the commercial mass market, for the chatbots, the video generators, the e-commerce recommendations, they want domestic chips. It is a way of having your cake and eating it too. Keep the top 1% of research on the cutting edge with Nvidia, but force the other 99% of the market to fund Huawei. This creates a bizarre market dynamic where being approved to buy Nvidia chips becomes a status symbol, a sign that your work is considered strategically vital, enough to warrant an exemption from the national self-reliance drive. Meanwhile, the U.S. government is watching this with a mix of confusion and frustration. The Trump administration's logic for approving the H200 was partly economic. Taking a 25% tax cut on $54 billion is a lot of money for the Treasury. It was also strategic, trying to maintain American dominance over the tech stack. By rejecting the chips, China is denying the U.S. that revenue and denying the U.S. that leverage. The irony is palpable. For years, the headline was U.S. bans chips to China. Now, the headline is China bans chips from U.S. The result is the same, a decoupled world, 2 separate spheres of technology drifting further apart. But what happens next? What happens to those 2 million chips? Does Nvidia dump them on the US market? Does the price of H200s collapse for Western companies because suddenly there's a surplus? Or does the demand from Amazon, Microsoft, and Google just absorb everything China rejected? We need to look closely at the reaction from the Chinese tech giants themselves. They are the ones caught in the crossfire. Tencent, Alibaba, ByteDance, these companies are publicly silent. They have to be, but privately, they are panicking. They know that without the H200, their training runs will take longer. Their electricity bills will be higher because domestic chips are generally less energy efficient. Their competitiveness against OpenAI and Google takes a hit. This is the internal conflict within China, the political goal of sovereignty versus the commercial goal of competitiveness. Right now, the political goal is winning. We also have to talk about the black market implications. Whenever you ban something that is in high demand, you create a crime wave. If legitimate channels for H200s are closed by both Washington with taxes and limits and Beijing with customs blocks, the price of a smuggled H200 is going to go to the moon. We might see a return to the days of people taping chips to their bodies to cross borders, but on an industrial scale. However, the Chinese government seems ready for this. The port crackdown mentioned in the reports suggests they are preemptively closing the smuggling routes. They don't just want to stop the legal imports. They want to stop the illegal ones too, because every smuggled Nvidia chip is a lost sale for Huawei. This is a total war on foreign compute. Let's look deeper at the corporate battlefield inside China. The reports mention that officials summoned domestic technology companies to meetings on Tuesday. Let's speculate on who was in that room. You have the cloud giants: Alibaba Cloud, Tencent Cloud, Baidu AI Cloud. These are the companies that rent out compute to everyone else. If they can't offer Nvidia H200s, their customers might look elsewhere. Except they can't, because no one in China can offer them. Then you have the application giants: ByteDance, TikTok, Meituan, startup unicorns like Moonshot AI and DeepSeek. These companies need massive clusters to train their next-generation models. The H200 was their hope for catching up to GPT-5 and Gemini 2.5. Now, they are being told to use the Huawei Ascend 910C. The problem is, the software ecosystem for Huawei, called CANN, Compute Architecture for Neural Networks, is not as mature as Nvidia's CUDA. CUDA has been around for almost 2 decades. Every AI researcher learns it in college. Every open source library is optimized for it. Moving from CUDA to CANN is like moving from speaking English to speaking a language you only learned from a textbook. It works, but it's slower, it's clunky, and you spend half your time translating instead of thinking. DeepSeek, one of the top Chinese AI labs, recently published research showing that the Ascend 910C delivers about 60% of the inference performance of an Nvidia H100. That is impressive for a sanctioned chip, but 60% is a painful number when you are competing with Google and Microsoft. And remember, that is against the H100. The H200 is even faster. So by forcing this switch, China is effectively accepting a compute tax. They are accepting that their AI models will train slower and cost more to run, in exchange for the guarantee that no one can shut them down in the future. It is a strategy of short-term pain for long-term gain. But in the fast-moving world of AI, short-term pain can mean irrelevance. 6 months in AI is like 10 years in traditional software. If China falls behind for 2 years while they debug their domestic chips, can they ever catch up? This brings us to the financial aspect. The report mentions that Nvidia required full upfront payment from Chinese customers for the H200s, largely due to the regulatory uncertainty. Nvidia denies this, saying they never charge for products not received. But if there were deposits made, or if capital was committed, that money is now stuck. And what about Nvidia's stock? The market reaction has been volatile. Nvidia shares were trading lower following the news. China has historically been 20 to 25% of Nvidia's data center revenue. If that goes to zero, or near zero, that is a massive hole in the balance sheet. Nvidia has been trying to pivot, selling more to US hyperscalers and sovereign AI clouds in the Middle East and Europe, but you don't just replace a $54 billion order book overnight. The timing of the smuggling bust in the US is also fascinating when viewed through this lens. The DOJ announced the charges against Alan Hsu and his ring on December 9, 2025, just weeks before this Chinese ban. It feels like both sides are clearing the decks. The US is cleaning up the leaks in its blockade, and China is sealing the doors on its side. The fake labels detail in the DOJ indictment is particularly wild. Sandkian. It sounds like a cheap knockoff brand you'd find on a shady e-commerce site. But underneath those stickers were the most advanced processors humanity has ever created. It shows the absurdity of this trade war. We have the most sophisticated technology on Earth being moved around like it's illegal narcotics. And now, the Chinese government is essentially acting as the DEA of chips, but against foreign supply. Let's zoom out to the political leverage angle again. Reva Gujan, a strategist at Rhodium Group, was quoted saying that Beijing is pushing to see what bigger concessions they can get. This makes sense. Trump loves a deal. He views everything as a transaction. If Xi Jinping can say, "Look, I am holding $50 billion of your company's revenue hostage. If you want me to release it, you need to drop the tariffs on our EVs." That is a classic negotiation tactic. But the cannibalization argument, the idea that they are protecting Huawei, feels stronger. The 910C is rolling out now. Reports say Huawei is preparing to produce 600,000 units next year, maybe ramping to millions. If the market is flooded with Nvidia H200 OS right now, those 910Cs sit in a warehouse. Huawei loses the cash flow, R&D slows down, the cycle breaks. By banning the H200, Beijing guarantees Huawei a customer base. It guarantees that every RMB spent on compute in China stays in China. It is the ultimate protectionist move. And remember, this isn't the first time we've seen this movie. China did something similar with social media. They banned Facebook and Twitter, which allowed WeChat and Weibo to flourish. They banned Google, which allowed Baidu to dominate. They are running the same playbook for the physical infrastructure of AI. The difference this time is that software is easy to replicate. Building a 7 nanometer or 5 nanometer chip without EUV lithography machines, which are also banned, is incredibly hard. Huawei is doing miracles with its multi-patterning techniques on older equipment, but the yield rates are low and the cost is high. This ban on the H200 might actually be a signal of confidence. Maybe Beijing knows something we don't. Maybe the 910C is better than the rumors suggest. Or maybe they are just desperate enough to take the risk. Consider the role of the special circumstances again. University research. Why exempt them? Because academic research is published. It contributes to global prestige. If Chinese universities stop publishing top-tier AI papers because they can't run the experiments, China loses its soft power in the scientific community. So they carve out a niche. But for the companies that are trying to make money, the Alibabas and Tencents, the message is, innovate or die, but do it with Chinese chips. The reports also mention that the H200 offers 6 times the performance of the H200. The H200 was Nvidia's attempt to play by the rules. It was a good chip, but it wasn't a great chip. Chinese companies bought it because they had to. But recently, even the H20 has fallen out of favor. In August 2025, there were reports that China urged firms to avoid the H20 as well. So this hostility to Nvidia has been building. The H200 ban is just the final nail in the coffin. It is the declaration that good enough American chips are no longer welcome, and superior American chips are definitely not welcome. This leaves the global AI landscape in a very fragmented state. You have the Western Bloc, running on Nvidia H200 OES and Blackwells, using CUDA, pushing the boundaries of scale with massive clusters. And you have the Eastern Bloc, running on Huawei Ascend, using CANN, optimizing for efficiency and sovereignty. Will these two branches of AI evolution diverge? Will Chinese AI develop different characteristics because of the hardware constraints? Maybe they will get better at code optimization because they don't have infinite brute force. Maybe they will focus on smaller, denser models, or maybe they will just fall behind. The sheer volume of the orders, 2 million chips, is what keeps sticking in my mind. 2 million! That is enough compute to train hundreds of GPT-4 level models simultaneously. That is enough compute to run the entire internet of a medium-sized country. And it is just stopped. Where does that demand go? It doesn't just vanish. The hunger for intelligence is infinite. If they can't buy Nvidia, and if Huawei can't make enough 910Cs yet, and they probably can't make 2 million next year, then there is a compute vacuum in China. Prices for cloud compute in China are going to skyrocket. Startups are going to burn through their funding just paying for server time. And this might trigger a brain drain. If you are a top Chinese AI researcher and you want to work on the biggest models and your lab in Beijing can't get GPS, do you stay? Or do you move to Singapore? Do you move to Silicon Valley? The hardware curtain might force a talent curtain. We also need to consider the reaction of the other players. AMD Intel. They also have AI chips. The MI300 series from AMD is a strong competitor. But if China is banning Nvidia to protect Huawei, they are certainly not going to roll out the red carpet for AMD. The policy is foreign versus domestic, not Nvidia versus everyone else. So as we wrap up this first part of the deep dive, let's summarize the battlefield. The US opened the door on January 13th, thinking they could flood the market and take the cash. China slammed the door on January 14th, deciding that sovereignty is worth more than speed. The gray market is being dismantled by the DOJ. The domestic champion Huawei is being force-fed the entire Chinese market, whether it is ready or not. And $54 billion of silicon is looking for a home. In the next part of this video, we are going to go even deeper. We are going to look at the specific technical cannibalization threat, why the 910C is so vulnerable to the H200. We are going to talk about the self-debugging nature of the Chinese market, how Alibaba and Tencent are practically rewriting their code bases overnight. And we are going to ask the biggest question of all, does this slowdown in China actually hurt the global progress towards AGI? Because if one of the world's two biggest AI engines suddenly starts sputtering, the whole vehicle might slow down. But now, we need to talk about the why. And more importantly, we need to talk about the how. Because when you peel back the layers of this story, you realize that this isn't just a trade dispute. It is a calculated, painful, and incredibly risky engineering gamble. China is betting its entire AI future on a domestic chip that, until very recently, was struggling to even turn a profit. We need to talk about the cannibalization theory in depth. To understand why Beijing would block the world's best AI chip, you have to look at the weapon they are trying to protect. The Huawei Ascend 910C. For the last year, the Ascend 910C has been the great white hope of the Chinese semiconductor industry. On paper, it is a beast. It is designed to go toe-to-toe with Nvidia's H100. It uses advanced packaging, high bandwidth memory, and runs on Huawei's proprietary Da Vinci architecture. But there is a massive difference between on paper and in the server rack. According to industry insiders and reports from the supply chain, the Ascend 910C has been fighting a brutal war against physics. The biggest issue has been yield rate. In the chip business, yield is everything. It is the percentage of chips on a silicon wafer that actually work when they come off the production line. For a mature process like Nvidia uses at TSMC, yields are typically over 90%. You print 100 chips, 90 of them work, you make money. But for Huawei, manufacturing at SMYC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, without access to extreme ultraviolet lithography (EUV) tools, the process is a nightmare. They have to use multi-patterning, essentially exposing the silicon multiple times to etch the same circuit. It is like trying to draw a perfect circle by tracing it 4 times with a shaky hand. If you miss by a nanometer, the chip is dead. Reports from early 2025 indicated that the yield rate for the Ascend 910C was sitting at a painful 20%. Imagine that. You print 100 chips and 80 of them go in the trash. That is economic suicide. However, recent updates suggest a breakthrough. By February 2025, reports surfaced that the yield had climbed to nearly 40%. Now, 40% is still terrible by TSMC standards, but for Huawei, it was the profitability threshold. It meant they could finally make the chips without losing money on every single wafer. They are now aiming for 60%. This is where the cannibalization fear comes in. Huawei is currently ramping up to produce roughly 600,000 of these units next year, with a goal of hitting a few million by 2026. But this ramp-up is fragile. It requires billions of dollars of investment, continuous factory tuning, and most importantly, guaranteed customers. If the Nvidia H200 is allowed into China, it destroys this ecosystem. The H200 is not just good. It is a finished, polished, dominant product. It is 6 times faster than the previous H200 chip that Nvidia was selling to China. It has no yield issues, it has no overheating issues, and that is the key. Reports have leaked that the Ascend 910C has been plagued by overheating and stability problems. There are stories of chips simply stopping to function under heavy loads. If you are a cloud executive at Alibaba or Tencent, and you have a choice between the Nvidia H200, which works perfectly, and the Huawei 910C, which might overheat and has a 40% manufacturing yield, you are going to buy Nvidia every single time. It's a no-brainer. And that is exactly what the US government was counting on. This is the trap we mentioned in part 1. The Trump administration's decision to approve the H200 export in January 2026 wasn't just about money. It was about dominance of the American tech stack. By flooding China with H200, says, the US would effectively kill the demand for the Ascend 910C. They would starve Huawei of the revenue it needs to fix those yield issues. They would keep Chinese AI addicted to American hardware. Beijing saw the trap, and they decided to step right over it, even if it meant shooting their own tech giants in the foot. And make no mistake, the Chinese tech giants are bleeding. The relationship between the Chinese state and its tech champions, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, has always been complicated. But right now, it is tense. According to a report from The Information, executives from these companies have been privately furious. In meetings with Huawei, they reportedly said, "It is not our job to adapt to Huawei's platform. Huawei should adapt to ours." That is a bold thing to say in China, but you can understand their frustration. Migrating from Nvidia to Huawei isn't just about swapping out a card, it is about software. The entire global AI industry runs on CUDA. It is the software layer that Nvidia built over 20 years. It is the language that PyTorch speaks. It is the language that TensorFlow speaks. Huawei has its own alternative called CANN, Compute Architecture for Neural Networks. But moving a massive large language model from CUDA to CANN is excruciating. DeepSeek, one of the leading Chinese AI labs, released a report showing that even with optimization, the Ascend 910 only delivers about 60% of the inference performance of an Nvidia H100. 60%! That is the compute tax we are talking about. By forcing this migration, Beijing is effectively telling its tech companies, you will be 40% slower than Google. You will be 40% more expensive than OpenAI, and you will like it, because it is for the good of the nation. This is the self-debugging market. We are watching a forced evolution. Because the H200 is banned, these companies have no choice but to fix Huawei's software. Alibaba engineers are now essentially working as unpaid Huawei R&D staff, writing drivers, fixing bugs in CANN, and optimizing kernels. It is a painful, messy process. But, and this is the scary part for the US, it might actually work. By forcing the entire Chinese ecosystem onto one domestic platform, they might accelerate the maturity of that platform faster than anyone expects. But there is one door that Beijing had to close to make this work: the smugglers. You cannot force a domestic monopoly if your customers can just buy the competitor's product on the black market. And this brings us to Operation Gatekeeper, the massive US Department of Justice crackdown that is happening in parallel with this ban. We touched on this briefly, but the details are straight put out of a movie. In December 2025, US authorities arrested Alan Hao-Su and shut down a network that had smuggled $160 million worth of GPUs into China. The DOJ revealed that this wasn't just a few guys with backpacks. This was a sophisticated, multinational logistics operation. They used a Houston-based company as a front. They falsified shipping documents. They stripped the Nvidia branding off the chips and relabeled them with fake names. One detail that stands out is the fake brand Sandkian. Imagine paying $30,000 for a piece of silicon that says Sandkian on it, knowing that underneath, it is the most advanced weapon in the AI war. The The DOJ seized over $50 million in cash and hardware in a single raid. This crackdown matters because it raises the risk premium of the gray market. If you are a Chinese startup and you want to smuggle H100s, the price just doubled again. And with the Chinese government now inspecting ports on their side to enforce the H200 ban, the gray market is being squeezed from both ends. So, where does that leave Nvidia? We have to talk about the financial crater this leaves in Santa Clara. Nvidia is a juggernaut. They just reported record quarterly revenue of $30 billion in late 2025. But China has historically been 20% to 25% of that revenue. We are talking about a potential $12 to $15 billion annual hit to their top line if the Chinese market goes to zero. Jensen Huang, Nvidia's CEO, has been playing a very difficult political game. On one hand, he says he wants to comply with all laws. On the other hand, he has been fighting tooth and nail to keep the Chinese market. But now, Jensen is pivoting. You can see it in his recent speeches. He has stopped talking as much about connecting the world and started talking about sovereign AI. This is Nvidia's new sales pitch. Jensen is flying to India, to Japan, to Canada, to France, and telling world leaders, you cannot let the US and China control your intelligence. You need your own AI infrastructure. You need sovereign AI. He is effectively trying to replace the Chinese market with a rest of the world market. He wants every country to build its own mini AWS, using Nvidia chips, of course. It is a brilliant strategy. It frames buying Nvidia chips not as a commercial expense, but as a matter of national security for these smaller nations. Protect your culture. Protect your data. Buy H200s. But even with that pivot, losing China is a massive blow. The 2 million chips that were supposed to go to Alibaba and Tencent now need to find new homes. This brings us to the final and perhaps most important question. What does this mean for artificial general intelligence, AGI? For the last decade, AI has been a global collaborative effort. Papers published in Toronto were read in Beijing. Code written in London was improved in San Francisco. That era is dead. We are now entering the era of bifurcated AI. On one side, you have the Western Bloc. It runs on Nvidia, it uses CUDA, it is driven by the massive capital of Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. It is chasing scale, bigger clusters, bigger models, more power. On the other side, you have the Eastern Bloc. It runs on Huawei. It uses CANN. It is constrained by hardware limitations. This constraint might lead to a different kind of innovation. If you can't just throw more raw compute at the problem because your chips are slower and yield is lower, you have to get smarter. You have to optimize your algorithms. You have to be more efficient. We are already seeing this. Chinese labs are publishing papers on small models and efficient inference that are shocking Western researchers. They are doing more with less because they have to. But there is a danger here too. The danger of an echo chamber. If Chinese AI is trained on Chinese data, running on Chinese hardware, filtered by Chinese sensors, and optimized for Chinese goals, it will develop a fundamentally different personality than Western AI. We are not just building two different computer industries. We are potentially building two different alien intelligences. And the blockade of the H200 is the moment where the timeline split. So what happens in the next 6 months? Watch the yield rates. If Huawei hits that 60% yield target on the 910C, then China's gamble pays off. They stabilize their supply chain and they become immune to US sanctions. But if the yield rates stall, if the overheating issues continue, then we might see a crisis in the Chinese tech sector. We might see Alibaba and Tencent start to fail in their service delivery. We might see the US pull further ahead in the race to AGI. And keep an eye on the special circumstances. If we start seeing reports that certain key laboratories in China are mysteriously getting deliveries of Nvidia chips while the commercial companies are starved, we will know that Beijing is playing a double game. As of today, the order book is frozen. The ships are turning around. The warehouses in Shenzhen are quiet. And the silicon iron curtain has been welded shut. This is the new reality. AI is no longer just code. It is geography. It is politics. And it is war. I'd love to know what you think. Is China's gamble to ban the H200 a masterstroke of long-term thinking, or is it an act of economic self-harm that will hand the AGI victory to the US? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to stay ahead of this invisible war, make sure you are subscribed. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.